Okay, so here we go. All right, I'm Tracey Testo, and I'm tuning in from Greene County, New York, located at the Agroforestry Resource Center, and that is part of Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene counties. And we're here today to talk a little bit about ginseng and to focus on some easy first steps to get folks started, and then some discussions around regulations, conservation, and maybe a few other things as well. And so this webinar is co-sponsored by the Cornell Small Farms Program and Cornell Cooperative Extension. In particular, it's being put on as a webinar series through our Agroforestry Program work team. And that is a collection of individuals across the extension and university system. And we're all collaborating on various agroforestry initiatives. And so you'll see here just a quick shot of some of the content from our website that we maintain. And we focus on, functioning as a gateway to resources and aspects of agroforestry that members on the team focus on. There are a number of additional practices related to agroforestry not included on the site, so it's not meant to represent agroforestry as a whole. It's just what we are engaged in, and you can click into each of these topics and see our kind of favorite go-to resources and some point people and contacts associated with these. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to just generally talk a bit about agroforestry efforts that I'm engaged with through my position here with Extension. I'm going to introduce kind of the star of the show here, American Ginseng. And then we're going to chat about some of your options for cultivation. And after I just share briefly what those are, we're going to really dive in and focus on wild simulated cultivation. I look forward to helping you all understand what that means. And then after that, just so we're all rooted in the regulatory aspect to make sure no one's violating any laws, we're going to just share the regulations that are established and tie them to the logic and reasoning behind their establishment. After we cover that, we're just going to check in on some grower recommendations and suggestions on how to navigate some of those regulations. And then we'll finish off with some shared resources and questions. So like I said, if things come up, feel free to put them in the chat. And then when we're done, we'll take this presentation down and answer some questions, and maybe we can share our videos then. Okay, so just in terms of those agroforestry efforts that we're particularly engaged in here at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene County. So we function at a few different levels. At a local level, we have our agroforestry center here in the Northern Catskills, and we have a 142-acre demonstration forest that goes along with our association, where we can not only educate people on agroforestry practices, but we can also engage them through our demonstrations. On a statewide level, I mentioned that program work team that functions throughout the Cornell Extension and University system. So that was that website that I just mentioned, and I'll have a link to that at the end. And then just larger picture, I just think it's important to know for folks to understand that agroforestry is something that the USDA engages in heavily. So there's actually a National Agroforestry Center that also houses nationwide resources and educational materials. And I can't go on to talk about ginseng without just briefly mentioning that our office here at Columbia and Greene is home to our New York State ginseng expert, Bob Bifus. And Bob has and continues to offer a great body of knowledge towards the conservation, cultivation, and education around American ginseng. So I look forward to sharing some of the work that he's put together and just continuing to expand on those resources that he's really built a career around developing. Thanks, Bob. Okay, and now we can really talk about ginseng. So in order to understand how to grow a plant, you need to kind of tune into its natural life cycle and natural habitats. So we'll start with the life cycle of the plant. Ginseng is a perennial herbaceous plant. And that means that its root system remains year-round while the tops of the plants are only present during the growing season. For ginseng, it's generally May through September. And it's always been recognized as a very high value agroforestry crop that can be grown in the right forest with a lot of patience. It's a long-term crop, more akin to cultivating trees as opposed to maybe your vegetables in the garden. And so I have some depictions here of the various shapes that ginseng takes at different stages in its life. So you can see here, it's a bit of a shapeshifter. On the left side here, we have a seedling. So that's what ginseng looks like when it first comes out of the ground. And it only has, what you see there are 3 leaflets. So altogether, those 3 leaflets make 1 leaf. And then it can go in one of 2 directions. It can the following year or maybe a few years down the line based on the habitat and whether or not the plant's requirements are being met. If it's growing really successfully, it'll follow that bottom line where it could, establish those 2 prongs. So 2 prongs mean they're basically 2 stems that come out to attach to different leaves. And then what you see there are 5 leaflets making up that 1 leaf. These different stages are not associated with years of the plant. It can take its own course, and it will. And so ultimately, when you reach a totally mature reproductive plant, you wind up with a 3-prong or a 4-prong plant. And on average, we know that that maturity and that stage of growth typically happens after about 10 years. And so on the illustration on the right, you can see just a line drawing of those leaflets comprising or making up that entire leaf. And then you see in the center there a berry cluster. So those would be red berries that emerge from the center of those leaf stems. And then you also see a line drawing of the root. The top of the root is referred to as the neck, and it has scars on the neck from the tops dying back and falling off every year. And those scars are really important. We're going to circle back to that and talk about them a little bit more later. So typically in New York State, ginseng will begin growing around May and continue to be above ground and productive until about September. Now here in New York State, ginseng has a very long lifespan. It can typically grow up to 30 years plus. After it reaches about 30 years of age, it does start to senesce. The root isn't necessarily putting on growth anymore, but it's actually starting to shrivel and kind of wrinkle and kind of just turn into an old man or woman root. So really long-lived plant, high value in New York State, and its range does continue throughout the entire Appalachians. And when you move more in the southern Appalachian region, it grows for a longer growing season because of their climate from March to November, but it typically doesn't grow much past 12 or maybe 15 years of age. So you're not really getting those old, quote unquote trophy roots in those southern regions. And so the price of wild ginseng, it's also the same price for wild simulated because they're indistinguishable. Wild simulated roots look just like wild roots. And so they're sold by the pound. And here in New York State and the Catskill regions in particular, you're generally seeing about $300 to $500 a pound for fresh root and $600 to $800 a pound per dried. Now you can see here, I did note that it can take anywhere between 30 to 100 roots to make 1 pound. So a lot of people hear those figures of the $500 per pound of fresh root and get really excited. But then, once you actually start harvesting, you could be looking at, upwards of 50, 60, 70 plants to reach that value. So it might not be as easy or accessible as it sounds, but that doesn't mean it's not achievable. And so there's really three main types of cultivation methods for American ginseng. Here in the US, the, I guess, most tried and true and long-standing for colonial settlers are field production. So this is a picture of a ginseng farm out in Wisconsin, and it's growing intensively in a field under simulated shade. And Wisconsin and Canada hold the most ginseng farms grown in this fashion. And so it actually follows, the early 1900s way of cultivating ginseng. So when ginseng really took off as a crop in the US in the early 1900s, there were little to no forested lands. They had mostly been clear cut by that time. So the environment for shade, this requirement of the plant was simulated by these structures. So large scale growers continue to grow this way. This is where a lot of seed sourcing comes from. And as you could imagine, an intensive monoculture style planting requires a lot of inputs. It requires amendments, alterations to the soil, and it requires a lot of pesticide applications because ginseng is highly sensitive to a number of diseases, mainly fungal. And so woods cultivated is another method for growing ginseng. And that is using your natural environment of a wooded area and the shade that it offers. But it typically implies that the soil is being altered to some degree, and the planting might be a little more dense and intensive. So the picture on the bottom left here, you can see is under the canopy of younger trees, but they're quite densely planted. And the soil here has most likely been tilled, mounded with nutrients probably added to maybe alter the pH or the soil, the rest of the soil chemistry to meet the plant's needs. And woods cultivated systems generally also do need some type of pesticide application. If a pathogen gets into one of these patches, it could devastate the entire patch and actually require you to start new in a different area if you don't choose to apply herbicides. And these plants, along with the field grown, do not typically live to that full, 30 years or so in age. They're shorter cycles, they grow faster and have those shorter lifespans. The roots also look quite different from wild or wild simulated. They look more like a carrot, like they had an easy life in amended soil that's been aerated, and there's not a lot of character to the root. Okay, so wild simulated is where I really want to focus some time today. It's kind of the realm of ginseng that I've stayed in, as we have a lot of really amazing forested habitats in this region. And I try to seek, applications and uses for all these woodlands that value woods and keep them as woods. And so once we get into kind of the needs and requirements of this plant, I'd encourage you all to think about the woods that maybe you have access to or perhaps own, or maybe woods around areas that's farmed, and start to kind of question where you think ginseng might grow, because it's more likely than not that it used to grow there and it was perhaps removed through years of harvesting. So this wild simulated approach really focuses on the conservation of ginseng through production, and can provide producers, stewards, or landowners diversified income and sustainable long-term revenue. And so it's not easy. It does require, to some extent, some in-depth knowledge of the plant, of how to produce it and how to navigate those regulations. So I hope that we can get you all kind of oriented to those and started to at least think about it today. And what we see here on the right is a photo by a friend of mine, Anna Plattner, and this is at one of the lands that she manages. And you can see the plants with the red berries attached to it are mature ginseng. I'm sure that if we looked closer, we would see some more immature plants scattered about there. But to me, this is just a beautiful scene of a natural forest floor with, you know, ginseng in its ideal habitat and form. Okay, and then so when you think about growing ginseng, there's a lot of nuance to it, and it actually makes it seem, I think, a little more intimidating than it actually is. But what I'm going to do is lay out all of the actual required conditions along with a lot of the preferred conditions for growing ginseng. And then once we move through all of that, I'll share some easy kind of next steps to kind of assess your woods or to actually just start diving in and trying out cultivation of the plant and working through it from, you know, that approach. So in terms of requirements, there's a few things that ginseng needs. It's high calcium, like at least 2,000 pounds per acre, a lot of organic matter, and we're looking at about 10% or more. And for folks who do soil samples for maybe like field crops, that number seems outrageously high. But where you're really actually collecting soil from is just within and below the duft, like the leaf layer of the forest floor, because that's actually where the majority of ginseng roots live and spend their time. Seeds are planted right into that duft, and ginseng usually grows just below the surface of the soil, and often its root tips will actually point upslope, uphill. So its roots stay right in that duft, right in that high organic matter, the calcium that they're getting from the tree leaves that are breaking down. And they typically want a pH of 4.0 or higher. So just to kind of get oriented to what your soils might offer, you can take a soil sample or you can dig into the USDA soil survey where you can actually just draw a line around your property and get an idea of what your soils look like. All right, so beyond those required conditions, there's a lot of preferences for ginseng. It seems like a pretty finicky plant. And so we'll kind of talk through those preferences. And these were established based on where ginseng is found in the wild and through the successes of growers, just where they've identified sites that work really well and common factors among those. So exposure, what direction your slope is facing is pretty important. Typically in the wild, ginseng is found on north or northeast facing slopes. And that's for a few reasons, but mostly because of their like cool, consistently moist and rich soils that are offered on north or northeast facing slopes. This plant is also found in a kind of a mid-mountain range. So here in the Catskills with elevations reaching upwards of 3,000 feet, that 1,500 foot mark is where most ginseng populations have been found, and under cultivation, it's also where it does best. And the slopes are generally 10 to 25%. And I often wonder if that's just because maybe slopes steeper than that aren't really navigated by sang hunters or stewards who are cultivating this plant, because it gets a little tricky to walk on. But that's, kind of where ginseng's found. And then areas that have hardwood trees, mixed trees that are hopefully larger or more mature. And that tells you a few things. Mainly it tells you that it's been a woodland for a long time. And, as I mentioned in the early 1900s, most of our forests were non-existent as they had been clear cut. A lot of that land was for some time used for livestock and other agricultural endeavors. So A thing to look for is whether or not your soils might have been compacted or impacted in some way by any of those efforts. So big old trees are really good to find. And then there's an understory community, a grouping of other perennial herbaceous plants that are often found in association with ginseng. And I just endearingly like to refer to these as the understory friends. We're gonna just share a quick list of what those are, but the list is kind of expansive and it really depends on the region that you're in. But in the picture I have here on the right, you can see a plethora of native herbaceous plants. So I'll just call out a few. Front and center, I'm seeing rattlesnake fern. That's referred to as sang pointer. Its reproductive feature points straight up and then will tip in one direction when the plant matures. And kind of old time ginseng hunters say that rattlesnake fern will always point you in the direction of ginseng. And so it could be 5 feet away or it could be 5 miles away, but it's apparently always pointing at ginseng. And then looking a little closer in the center there, I'm seeing maidenhair fern. On the top, blue cohosh. There's a couple more there, but I think those are the clearest ones. And then just another site condition that we generally look for are fewer surface rocks, and that's maybe more a consideration for whether or not you can plant out that area. So in the bottom picture here, I just have a snapshot of a wild simulated ginseng farm that I worked on for a little bit, quite a few years ago. And it was just a typical scene of what it looked like during the planting season, which is October. So those types of woods. And then when you dig into the trees a little bit more, you find that that really guides your decision making. And so trees are kind of the first thing most people notice when they're entering a forested habitat. And so you can use those to guide you. And in this region of the Appalachians, the number one tree species to look for to associate ginseng with is sugar maple. And that's for a few reasons. That high calcium requirement that I talked about, those needs are met by the calcium that's offered in the leaves of the sugar maples when they're breaking down in the forest floor. Their leaves have high calcium and they're actually already in a plant available form. So they're highly accessible for the ginseng root. And they do not alter the pH, which calcium in an added form typically does. Something else that sugar maple is really good at is hydraulic lift. So that's its ability to bring water to the surface. So sugar maple has some really deep, nice tap roots that anchor the tree, but it has a high amount of feeder roots that linger just below the soil. So those deep roots bring up water to consistently keep those feeder roots moist. And that level of moisture that's maintained is actually exactly what ginseng likes as well. And so what we don't generally want to see is a monoculture of trees, mostly because diversity is part of what makes our woodlands really healthy. But so low diversity can put your woods at risk. And if you're thinking about establishing and growing a long-term crop, you want to make sure you have that forest health piece covered in terms of the diversity of the trees in your woodlands. So if there's a pest or a pathogen or some issue, you're not going to lose your entire canopy cover in one fell swoop. So in addition to sugar maple, some of the other trees we look for are the presence of black walnut or butternut, which are two closely related species. And then some other mixed hardwoods like beech, black cherry, red maple, ash, red oak, and basswood. This is not a comprehensive list. Like I said, there's a lot of ranging habitats for this plant. So some of those herbaceous species we already talked about. Here's a close-up picture of that rattlesnake fern. And on the top right there is white baneberry or doll's eye, which is another common name. But in addition to that, some other things to look for are obviously a wild ginseng population. If you find that, you know you're on the right track. And also, if you've ever planted any ginseng there, if there's reproduction of those plants, that's something else to look for. And then a few of those other plants that I already talked about, the maidenhair fern and the blue cohosh, but a few additional ones are also stinging nettle and that baneberry plant, like I mentioned. And so some grower considerations to think about are, the areas that you may or may not be choosing to work in or around. So here's where you might want to consider that slope a little more closely. If you're choosing to plant ginseng in a forested habitat and it's a really steep slope, you could hurt yourself, or you'd certainly just wear out your shoes pretty quickly. You're also likely to experience more of your seeds rolling downhill from runoff. So having, a more gentle grade is advantageous for your planting. Rocks are another consideration. Sometimes we just have to take what we can get, but if you're interested in digging into the rocks a little bit more, you can do this really informal rock test and walk through the woods, poke a stick in the ground each time you step. And if your rock can be poked through 3 out of 4 times, then they can be tolerated. Oh, I'm sorry, if your stick can be poked through 3 out of 4 times, the rocks can be tolerated. But if you are like mostly just hitting rock or hitting rock half the time, you might want to think about finding another site or working around some of those rocks. Pest pressure is a strong consideration for whether or not ginseng will be successful. And your main pests to think about are deer. And so what we see here on the right is a kind of innovative way to use some welded wire fence and fold it down and over ginseng growing out of the forest floor to prevent deer browse. Slugs are another pest that have to be considered, and I'll give some guidance on how to just assess what your slug population might be like and how to navigate that. And then some other things like rodents, chipmunks like to eat seed, mice could as well. And depending on exactly when you plant, turkey can also be an issue because they'll scratch and eat the seed. And then something else to think about more long-term, if you're establishing this plant, is security. If you're thinking about maybe putting up like a deer fence and doing a large-scale planting, that could potentially draw some attention. And as I mentioned, those kind of high values get some people excited, and poaching and theft of ginseng is not unheard of or uncommon. So that is a real consideration. So just some general recommendations are to try to locate your plantings in close proximity to your residence, or at least a site that you can visit on a daily basis. The picture here on the left here is me with my, quote unquote guard dog. She mostly just slept while I planted, but I think it's still helpful if you can have a dog with you in the woods, because, they at least will chase away the chipmunks and the turkey and the deer and kind of keep them away from your planting site. I've actually heard of folks who use fencing and will bring dogs in that fencing at least once a day to keep their scent around. So that can be pretty effective. Okay, so that was a lot of information about the growing considerations, and I'm sure you all can't read this, but this is a site assessment that was developed by Bob Byfuss, and it is available in online resources that I'll share at the end. So it's actually walking through that list of those required and other needs for ginseng, and it's a ranked point system. So you can go through your woods and rate them and total your points at the end to see just generally whether or not it's a good or a poor site. Now there's a lot of variability in the woods, as you all might know. So meeting these requirements, such as maybe the exposure or the orientation of your slope, can vary quite a bit. So I always encourage people to not forget about those little microclimates that you might have. Like maybe you have a stream with banks on both sides, running down a slope that would orient that soil into a different direction. So there's a lot of variability, but I think this is a good way just to really start to key into those needs of the plant. And so thinking about how to actually get started with all that information can be a little overwhelming. So I'm going to give just some general startup steps here, but then I'm really going to dive into how you can establish test plots. And that is my biggest recommendation, is to just get out there and plant some seeds and check them out and see how they do. But for those general startup steps, we encourage folks to start with that site assessment. So using that score sheet that I just showed. Just taking a soil test or maybe a couple scattered throughout areas that you're considering. And then for folks who are really looking to kind of dive right in and to maybe start just scattering some seed as opposed to going to the test plot route, you can really start to dive into site prep at this point. So when you're thinking about growing a plant on the forest floor, sunlight is a consideration. Now, ginseng likes to be in the majority in the shade, but it does need some sun, especially beginning its life. It can actually prefer a little bit lower than 70% in the first few years. So if you have really mature woods with a totally closed canopy that feel really dark inside, it can be helpful to engage in some timber stand improvements or some really light thinnings to just open up that canopy a little bit more. And to consider that it will quickly close in. So if you're making some really light alterations in the forest, I try to aim for that 60 or 65% shade. So I know that during years 1 through 3, when ginseng is growing most vigorously, it's getting that sunlight it needs. And this can be done through just kind of estimating percent shade, or you can actually use a tool called a densiometer. It's a forestry tool, and it's just a simple tunnel that you look through with a grid that give you those percent density numbers of the canopy. Some other site prep considerations could be removing the ground cover or like weed whacking an area that you might plan to intensively plant. Another approach to this is just waiting until that vegetation dies back because ginseng planting with seed happens in the fall. And so, ideally you want to get seed on the ground right before the first snowfall. That way it's most protected from pest pressures. So if you're waiting that late in the season, a lot of that perennial vegetation will have already died back. So you won't really need to engage that much in removing any ground cover. And it's at this time that we generally recommend you start assessing some threats that you might have. So there's some simple ways to kind of get a rough idea of what your slug pressures might be. Some people like to use mouse traps to kind of tune into how high their chipmunk population is, just all options for folks. And then there's a couple different ways you can think about planting. So, when you're planting ginseng, you're removing the leaf litter from the forest floor and putting those seeds directly in contact with it. So if you're doing smaller plantings, that's generally just done by a metal rake where you expose the soil, plant the seed, put the leaves back on the soil. If you're doing larger strips or swaths, a backpack leaf blower is used by some of those more large scale growers. And then, like I said, plant right before the snow falls if you can. Now we'll just dig in a little bit to what those test plots look like. So here's a snapshot of me and my colleague over in our Siusla model forest establishing some of these, and they're pretty simple. It's a 3x3 plot that's marked out with survey flags. You can do as many or as little of these as you want, but if you're thinking large scale, it's generally recommended that you do at least 40 per acre, but that's totally dependent on the goals of you as the grower. And so once you have those 3x3 plots marked out, you count out 50 seeds And if you're just getting started, most people will buy an ounce or two of seed, and they're usually sold for about $20 per ounce, where you can get about 500 seeds. So you could use those ounces to break out into groups of 50. Once you have your 50 seeds, you'll rake back the leaves, rough up the soil, try to increase the surface area of the soil for that ginseng root. And if you have any large, like flat rocks that are covering the soil, pull them right out of that 3x3 plot. And then as evenly as you can, or as precisely as you would like to, you can scatter your 50 seeds in that plot. And after the seeds are scattered, just do a visual look and you can see if they're like touching one another and kind of space them out. And once they're settled and you're happy with where they are, you walk on them, or you can do a little ginseng dance. And you do this to make sure that the seeds are really snug with that soil, but not planted too deep. If you're sticking holes and planting in seeds, it most likely will rot and it will not come up. And so once you're done with your little dance, you can rake leaves back over the plots. And this is generally done in September to mid-October, but if you're only doing a small planting, I would recommend you push it as late as you can. So you leave those flags in place, and ideally it's recommended that you write a number or a code on those flags associated with each plot, and then start recording your data, because you'll use these findings to ultimately make more meaningful decisions on expanding your plantings. So that was the fall of year one. And now following that, in the spring of year two, hopefully you look into some of your test plots and you see what I got the picture of up here in the corner. And that is a baby ginseng seed up by my index finger. And if you look even closer by my thumb, you can see a smaller ginseng seedling that has just emerged. So as soon as the snow melts, it's recommended that you begin inspecting your plots. So right off the bat, before the plants even come up, you can start trying to figure out what your slug population might be like. And you can do that through some pretty simple slug traps. It's mainly just beer. You can use like a 2-liter and cut off and then invert the top to make a funnel. Put some beer in there, lay them alongside your test plots, and then check on them maybe once a week or so. And so you can start to see how big of a threat slugs might be. And if you're catching more than a few every couple of weeks, you might want to consider trying to reduce the populations of slugs, or choosing another site in the future. So there are a few good organic options for that, and there's a ton of non-organic options. So then come May, or maybe even June in some more higher elevation areas, you'll begin to see seedlings emerge. So once the seedlings come up, you can start counting them to determine what your germination rate is. And so since we put 50 seeds in each plot, you just multiply the number of seedlings by 2 to figure out that % germination. And you can continue to do this out throughout the first summer season, or you can just do it intermittently. But by the fall, around September, at the end of the season, you'll be left with your survivability rate. So you can start to compare different test plots that you have throughout your property, and you can start to see what's doing well and what's not. So if you start to see that you have some areas that are doing really, really well, consider expanding those even that second year in the fall. And so from that 3x3 foot plot, you can expand those out to a 10x10. And after about 3 years of growth, you'll have to actually start thinning the ginseng seeds, which feels kind of crazy to growers. But if you leave them too dense, then you're likely to get impacts from fungal or bacterial diseases. So once they're about 3 years old, you're kind of left with those successful seedlings, and you can thin them back to 1 plant per square foot. That's ideal spacing for ginseng. And just some recommendations for data that you might want to collect. Obviously a number or a code or something to associate with the plot, the dates of when you planted them, the dates of when you're checking those germination survivability rates, slugs or other pests that you might be seeing. But what I really like to try to key into at this point are soil conditions, moisture levels, other plants that are associated that are, maybe impacting how well or how not well the ginseng is growing. So on your own land, you can kind of tune into the variabilities that exist and where you may or may not find success. Okay, and so Scott Persons and Janine Davis put out a book quite a few years ago now, I think, 2005. And Scott Persons put together this potential profit sheet. And so I know folks are generally, curious about kind of long-term what we're talking about here for returns or earnings. And so this breaks down a 9-year budget for a half-acre planting. And so you can see that seed is pretty expensive. And even since 2005, it hasn't fluctuated much. You can still find it for about $80 per pound. And this also kind of reflects what labor is looking like. So you can get a sense that it's not really just a set it and forget it plant. You can see here down in inspection and troubleshooting the amount of time spent, but granted, this is over a 9-year period. But as I outlined there with those test plot establishments, even after like that 3-year period when your ginseng is starting to grow well and coming in, you still want to keep eyes on the plant because things could change kind of quickly out there in the woods without checking in on them. And so this also looks at drying and the sale of dried roots. But you can see after 9 years on that small half-acre, your net profit is looking like around 22,000. Okay, so after hoping to share and help you all develop a little bit more of an understanding of what it takes to grow the plants, I think it's important for everyone to understand the regulations that are in place. As I mentioned, wild simulated ginseng is indistinguishable from wild plants. So being familiar with these regulations will help you protect yourself long term. So ginseng is protected under CITES. That's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. That's the same protection that includes things like ivory from elephant tusks. And so the conservational logic behind the establishment of that protection was because ginseng's been harvested for centuries, but it's a really slow growing plant. And the overharvesting has really put the wild populations at risk. And so to ensure that plants remain healthy and wild across our landscape, these were adopted in 1987. And really, they were adopted to not only protect the plant, but to allow ginseng to be grown, stewarded, and harvested. So these are really functioning regulations that are tied to that conservation. So part of those regulations were the establishment of a season for collection. And that season for collecting roots is from September 1st to November 30th. And before that September 1st, date, ginseng is referred to as being green and it's prohibited for sale. And so the reason that that was established is because ginseng berries are not fully ripened until the beginning of September. So waiting until that collection season ensures that those mature berries are ready to go in the ground and continue to expand those wild populations. Maturity was another aspect of those regulations that were established. And so the law states that a ginseng plant has to be a minimum of 5 years old before it can be harvested and sold. And I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about the botany of the plant that it has a neck with scars from the stem that died back, the top part of the plant that died back every year. So actually exposing the root by pushing back some soil and counting the scars on the neck of that plant will give you a rough estimate of its age. Now, for anyone who's engaged with ginseng before, you might know it doesn't necessarily come up every year. So sometimes ginseng will just stay below soil. Maybe it was browsed and impacted. Maybe it's apical bud, the piece of the plant that is responsible for the aerial growth, could have been damaged. So that 5 years is important for just ensuring that that ginseng is able to produce seed. Now, we do know that the average maturing age of ginseng is really more like 10 years. So just a heads up, we might see some of the language in these laws shift in the near future. And so in addition to waiting until that 5-year period, ginseng seeds that are found on those plants that are being harvested are required to be planted within 50 feet of that collection site. And so that's just to make sure that, again, those wild populations remain, because ginseng cannot propagate itself by root, only by seed. And the third piece of that regulation is tied to landowner permission and harvesting from private land. So in New York State, no harvesting can occur on any state lands. And I often find that's a little bit of a shocker to some folks who might have been stewarding populations on state land for quite some time, but the only flexibility that's given is if permits are issued for research. And so if you're harvesting ginseng from your own land, you have to show proof of being the landowner, or if you're harvesting from maybe a friend's or someone else's property, you have to have written permission. And so that's really just to ensure that you're not, impacting wild populations too extensively, but mainly that you're also not digging from someone else's patch. Ginseng stewards invest a great deal of time and money into their patches of plants, and it can be wiped out pretty quickly after, spending maybe even perhaps decades to establish and maintain those populations. And so just some quick kind of generalizations to follow those conservation practices. We have some do's and don'ts that are associated with those. So what we do recommend is that you study the plant and conditions before harvesting, learn how to identify it as a start, learn that process and get comfortable with determining the age of a plant. Really try to key into the surrounding environment so you can build on those conservational practices. And then work to identify woodlands that are accessible for you for harvesting, for planting, for stewarding. So, we encourage folks to contact private landowners, form relationships, and that's where some potential might be unveiled around establishing, maybe long-term leasing or more formalized arrangements for folks that might not have their own woods or might not have the right conditions for it to grow. We also recommend that you scout for wild ginseng patches just throughout the year and start taking notes of the sizes and the ages of the plants. And what we don't want to do here is just go out in September during harvesting season and dig, the first plant or two that you see, because for all you know, those could be the only ones there. Checking the age, I think we covered the rest of this. Oh, and then sowing the seeds around the plant. And like I said, these laws were established to protect the conservation of ginseng, but if you're stewarding a woodland and, you take those seeds maybe a bit more beyond 50 feet to an area that you've identified as being really prime ginseng habitat, no one's going to come onto your land and scold you or fine you for that. Those tasks, those activities are really associated around the conservation of ginseng. So I just think it's helpful to root these laws in reality. And so, when thinking about all the laws that are in existence around wild ginseng and noting that wild simulated ginseng is indistinguishable once it's out of the ground, this can mean a few things for you as a potential grower. So some things that folks don't like to do are really document and take pictures and keep records of their plantings, but it's really important to at least have some minimal documentation of your seed purchase or a picture of your test plots, just so in the event down the road that something happens to your patch, you have something to fall back on. So as I mentioned, ginseng theft is not unheard of in this area, or I guess the entire range of ginseng as a whole. But if you purchased and planted that seed and you tended that patch for 5 years or so and have documentation of all of that, that's your personal property. So if that is taken out of your woods, that's stealing, that's theft. Whereas if someone trespassed on your woods and took a wild plant that you didn't really engage with, that falls under the guidelines of poaching, where the offenses or the crime is a little less intense than stealing your personal property. And so beyond that, we encourage people to engage with or at least meet their region's state inspector. Now, you might not have even known that New York State DEC maintains a ginseng inspector for each region of the state. So just kind of being upfront and talking to those folks can kind of just start you on the right path long term. And something else to consider are certification programs. So there aren't a ton up and running right now, but one that I know that still functions in New York State that includes ginseng is a program called Certified Naturally Grown. And it's pretty like low stakes, low investment, but it does tie your cultivation methods to good conservational practices. So you can use it to, potentially help brand your product. And so off the DEC website, they maintain all of these state laws and regulations, but here's just a quick snapshot of all of those ginseng inspectors that are employed through the DEC. So you can, determine what region you are located in the state, and then identify your contact person and, reach out or use them as a resource. And then just thinking long term, once you're ready to harvest your root and start engaging in the sale, there's also a set of regulations around this protected under that same CITES piece. And so this is just really a check and balance to make sure that you followed all of those state regulations. And so in order for ginseng to be taken out of state and sold, whether it's sold within the country beyond New York State or outside of the country, it has to be certified by the DEC inspector. And so generally, just to share how this goes, throughout the state, there's also ginseng dealers. Yes. So you can follow some forms and regulations on the DEC site and become a ginseng dealer. And those dealers are able to grade and purchase ginseng from local growers. So if you're harvesting in the fall and you want to go onto the DEC website, you can find a list of over 500 dealers that are in New York State and start reaching out and set up appointments with those dealers. The value of ginseng root is highly variable depending on its age, its characteristics, a number of things. So working with those ginseng dealers will help you grade your ginseng. And then generally, those ginseng dealers are also the purchasers. They'll buy the ginseng and then work with the state agency to certify and export. And the vast majority of ginseng that goes through these channels are exported to Asia. All right, and I just wanted to make sure we end with some shared resources. So there's a couple web-based resources. The first one here is the Practical Guide to Growing Ginseng, and that was written by Bob Bifus. Within that guide is that visual site assessment, and that is housed for free in the Cornell Library for anyone to download. Many of these resources can also be accessed through that um, Agroforestry program work team page that I shared at the beginning. So that one on getting started right for ginseng production is on the Small Farms page. There's a number of videos that Bob and other experts have put together. And I would also encourage folks just to check out the DEC page, just to kind of get familiar with where a lot of those resources are located. And then there's a couple of really good books I just wanted to point to. Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals is the text where that profit chart came from, written by Scott Persons and Janine Davis. Steve Gabriel and Ken Mudge wrote a book called Farming the Woods a couple years back, and it's got some great content on ginseng. And then last but not least, another friend of mine, Justin Wexler, recently published a book called Plants of Mid-Atlantic Ginseng Habitat, and that helps you associate those ginseng friends with successful growing sites. All right, thanks everyone. I'm glad to see we're ending right around 4, so we do have a good amount of time for some questions. Stop sharing my screen and pull open the chat here to see how we're doing. So I see the most recent one was a question about where it can be purchased. There's quite a few distributors and sellers of seeds. That first document I listed by Bob that has the visual site assessment has a list of producers and suppliers of ginseng material. Ginseng seed is a little tricky and perhaps controversial in some respects. Some folks feel strongly about maintaining local genetics. So some growers might be opposed to bringing in seeds from Wisconsin or Canada and then allowing them to become established in these areas and then maybe crossing with our wild ginseng plants. So some folks will strive to identify more, in-state seed producers, but they are hard to come by. So just a consideration there. And I will just try to make sure by the end of this to put a link in the chat so folks can download that document. Just going up a little bit more. Are you aware of any research exploring ginseng forest farming in the Pacific Northwest? Oh, I am not, but I do know there is a ton of overlap in forest farming endeavors between, this region in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest. Shiitakes are a good example, but there is ginseng research that happens throughout the country. The University of Missouri's Agroforestry Center is always engaged in some, but it does seem like there could be some potential there. I think you might want to start with a test plot or just at least a soil sample to see what's going on. Someone asked about ginseng growing in the tropics. Not this species of ginseng. So this ginseng is American ginseng. It's Panax cinquefolius, and there are a host of other ginseng plants in the Panax gene. But none that I can think of off the top of my head that grow well in the tropics. Some other notable species might be Siberian ginseng, which certainly doesn't grow in tropical regions, and Asian ginseng, which obviously grows in Asia. Someone commented on the pH being low. So that's the lowest. 4 is the kind of the lower end of the range, but yeah, so they're asking if being closer to 6 or 7 is okay, or if it needs acidity. It does need some slight acidity. So I think ideally between 4 and 6 is preferable. And, even with wild simulated ginseng, some folks might alter the pH a bit, maybe through, liming the soil with gypsum or something like that. So even though you're not like tilling the soil, you can still apply some of those amendments and still kind of fall under that wild simulated category. So someone was just asking for me to share the DEC inspectors. I'm going to go ahead and just pull up the DEC site and put it right in the chat. Now I'm copying in the DEC page. And on that, you can scroll down to find a list of links. So it'll have all of those regulations, but you can click to download the dealers, and you can also see a chart of all of the state inspectors. Ooh, so someone's asking about the viability of the seed after it's harvested. So the seed is alive and it's not to be treated like an annual that can be dried out. It's engaged in air exchange and it needs to be kept under certain conditions to ensure that it'll be viable. So ginseng seed actually requires 2 stratification periods. So it needs to go through a warm and cold cycle, a summer and a winter, twice before it will germinate. It needs to break shoot and root dormancy during those 2 years. So often, good quality ginseng seed that's purchased will be stratified. So say now in July of this year, I wanted to purchase ginseng seed. I should be getting it from someone who harvested the seed this past fall and who has appropriately exposed it to that cold and then that warm cycle. So when I receive the seed, it's ready to go in the ground and will emerge the following year. There's actually a visual inspection you can do for this. The ginseng seed kind of looks like a lentil. It's about the size and the shape of a lentil. And around the thin margin of the seed, there's a seam. And once the ginseng seed has been exposed to that first stratification period, that seam will crack and it'll expose a little bit of white, the interior of the seed. And it's referred to as smiling. So it means the seed has been properly prepared. And we like to say that it's happy and ready to go in the ground. And so that seed, I'll just mention, does need to go in the ground that fall. And you keep it in your refrigerator, maybe with a little bit of sphagnum moss or something that will hold on to a little bit of the moisture, but not so much that the seed will rot. And I think this has happened to everyone who grows ginseng seed, but if you don't get around to planting all of it that fall, and the snow falls and the ground freezes and it's still in your fridge, you can try to really first thing in the spring plant those seeds. Germination rate is much lower in the spring. That seed has been kind of unhappy and sitting in your refrigerator for a long time and it's lost some of its viability. And I often have found when I've left seed in my refrigerator that it'll actually germinate and sprout, which is a bad sign because then you can't just scatter that seed. You have to try and painstakingly plant each individual emerging seedling in the spring. And again, you're really damaging and reducing your survivability rates there. And I'm just seeing a couple folks ask about the availability of this and the recordings being made available. So yes, this whole presentation has been recorded and it's going to be added to the Cornell Small Farms YouTube channel. And it can also be found at our program work team's website, which I'm adding in the chat. Wait, it's Cornell Agroforestry, .org. Let me rewrite that. So I think I've answered most of the questions in the chat. If Other folks have some, you can feel free to just, pop off mute or just continue to add some in the chat. And I'm just going to scroll through to make sure I've caught all of them. Okay. All right, I think I've gotten all of them. I'm just going to copy in one more link to that guide on growing ginseng. So this has the suppliers for ginseng material, and it has that visual site assessment. All right, folks. We got another one. Yes, resurrect the formal Catskill Ginseng Festival. It's a career goal of mine. Um, it's a festival that Bob Bifus used to hold, and I'm really hoping to re-engage some growers statewide and start kind of connecting those groups again. Some of you might know that the ginseng world can be a secretive one, and for good reasons, but it can be so helpful for us all to kind of get together and share our successes and our failures so we can all do a little bit better in the cultivation of this plant. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and feel free to reach out or stay in touch if you have more questions. I'm going to stick my email address in the chat here, and I wish you all success in hopefully your ginseng cultivation journey. Thanks, everyone.